Okay, well, I'll start with a health warning, which is to say that I'm talking specifically about non-Indian media, because I know about that much about the media market in India. You'll recognize some of that as we go through. I think also, reflecting on those last couple of presentations, last couple of sessions, I would say that there are so many ways for us to talk about what's happening in media, and my particular emphasis is to talk about business models, really. We're all in business, and we all need to make money from media, new and old, and I really wanted to concentrate on kind of what works, what doesn't work, and particularly how part of what I'm saying is how we got into this bind in the first place, because I think there are strands in those discussions there, you know, where we're talking about advertising and whether people paying for something, you know, are entitled, whether they should expect an advertisement to be thrown at them and so on, and we can all know how attitudes have changed over time. So let me charge into it. I've essentially, he says, just working out how this works, where I'm pointing this. No, that's further back. Right, okay. So I'm talking in 5 chapters. I thought I'd use a nice old-fashioned word. How we got here, how it's changing. Most of us could do this. And I think that's one of the sort of initial points I'd like to make here, is that this is a hell of a big discussion of all of us. And I'm, just because I'm coming from England or from anywhere else, or anybody else is coming here, you know, most of us don't have privileged knowledge and privileged access. We just have a point of view. So as far as I'm concerned, every single one of the comments I'm making here is a discussion rather than my biblical view that this is how life should be or could be, because I think that if any of us knew that, then we probably wouldn't waste too much time in a conference room. We'd probably go out there and make the money that we ought to make. So I'm going to start with how we got here, how it's changing, what I think are sustainable trends. I'll then traipse through 13 companies. In some ways, it's a kind of random selection. I do this monthly blog. It's essentially a monthly blog. I do an essay once a month on disrupted media called Flashes and Flames. Flashes and Flames does a few other things as well, but fundamentally it's built around the blog. And so I tend to look at individual companies and what they tell us. Again, they're not the 13 best companies we could all name. Some of them may or may not be. They're not the 13 unrivaled successes or unique examples. They're just 13 companies, each of which are doing interesting things that I think can tell us something. And we're searching for these strands in everything we do. You know, what does this example tell me that I can apply? And so that's the spirit of these 13 companies that I've chosen there, all of which one way and another have a lot more detail on Flashes and Flames. And then what I think are the 5 things that particularly traditional media really need to take account of if they're hoping to earn a living in the digital space. So just initially, just as I think my grandmother must have written the piece on the left about me. My pedigree is I've managed media businesses, mostly traditional media businesses in 4 or 5 different countries, and one of my, and therefore by definition you're looking at a guy who's over 40 years old, so therefore most of the businesses I've run have been good old-fashioned businesses. But in 1993, I kid you not, I published the world's first internet magazine. There are 2 things I would say about this fantastic commercial success, you could tell, can't you? One of them is that it made the claim of listing every single website available, which was 100 and something. The other thing, and I won't dwell on this, the other thing is that the first issue sales of this magazine, because there weren't very many people on the web in 1993, the first issue sales were smaller than the number of web companies that we were referring to. So, so that's the failure I move on from. What I think fundamentally, and we can, you will feel the strands of my thinking and the previous discussion particularly, I really believe that traditionally media, and all kinds of media, was, this aggregated collection of things, some of which the reader never wanted and never asked for. So we were quite often, and I think this applies whether it's a magazine or a newspaper, whether it's very specialist or very general. I think fundamentally it was a bundle of things. That's where we come from, bundling it all together and charging as much as we possibly can in most cases. So we gave them what they chose, we gave them stuff that they just put up with, and sometimes we left out things that they were hoping we would cover because we were in charge, as a previous speaker said. Today the reader, a user, is in charge, but we as publishers were in charge, and so we gave them what we wanted. I think, therefore, the way that translated was that there was some exclusive, distinctive content, presumably. You wouldn't be in business if you didn't have that. There was a fair chunk of stuff. The proportions are pretty broad estimates, but there was a good proportion of stuff that was just freely available everywhere that we pretended was ours. There was loads of stuff. We can see it in newspaper. We could see it over the years in newspapers all the time. A good percentage of stuff that was just common to all. So I think that's where we've come from. And I think that when I talk in the UK and Australia, particularly to publishers of newspaper companies, I think that I try to talk through this idea that we weren't perfect people coming into this world that has suddenly dealt us a savage blow, unjustly made my life hellishly difficult, because we were operating in this privileged world where we did what we liked. And that's an extreme view to take, but I would say that was a sustainable point of view. And I think, again, to pick up a strand that we've heard already, I think that print media was spoilt by advertising. And really, I think that there are no better examples of this than the daily newspapers, often referred to as Fleet Street in the UK, because I was looking around for a chart that I couldn't find in preparing for my talk today, but if you took the figures for the increase of advertising in daily newspapers in the UK from 1960 to 1980, areas of big growth, there's a matching line. It's a fabulous line that businesses in the UK and America haven't felt since. And there's almost a matching line about the employment of journalists on daily newspapers in the UK. So what was happening is that these businesses were being being swollen and growing, completely unrelated to their ability to win readers. Sometimes circulations were going up, sometimes down, but advertisers were spoiling them. And of course what was happening with all these newspapers is they kept the cover price down because it was a darn sight easier to get profit from advertising than it was from readers. So the lower the cover price, perhaps even pumping out free copies of newspapers, the better you did on advertising. And I would say to you that if you take traditional media nearly anywhere, there's an element of this. When there's a lot of advertising, we all get hooked on that. And I think that completely changed traditional media during those years. There will be equivalents of those years here, I would suggest, in this country and in other countries. You can be at a different place in the cycle, but fundamentally, print media enjoying these two revenue streams, I would argue these are conflicted interests. I think if the example I like to use is if Heinz baked beans were sponsored, they wouldn't care what you thought of the content, would they? And I think that arguably we're going towards a world where if we're selling to readers and users, we won't be able to get advertising. But certainly, the problem was that advertising became a dominant medium in many of the areas of traditional media, and I think it helped to ruin the business. So I think, I'm sure there's a good argument with a lot of people here, but I think print media was spoilt by advertising. I'm talking about the Western examples I know best. I'm not talking about examples, here I am in a media market where advertising is still growing, God knows, and where many print circulations are still growing. So you'll just have to accept that I've stepped from a different time zone into a different market. But I think that print media and print-centric media, if you like, print into digital, has to learn to live without much advertising, if any, because our readers demand more from us. You know, and I would argue that our readers of traditional media brands, again, whether in print or digital, they are quite often loyal to media brands, of course. That's what we know. But actually, they're not endlessly loyal like they used to. The limited supply of media, and again, whether it's a motoring magazine and information service or a newspaper or a woman's magazine, there was a time when the supply of these things was strictly limited, and people, therefore, were hugely dependent on a relatively small number of sources. They had a sort of total belief in whatever it was they were reading, and particularly in daily newspapers, because there wasn't anywhere else to go. But now, our best readers are people who search around. We don't have to fool them anymore to saying, well, this is the news as presented by us. There isn't any other news. You can't go anywhere else. There is no need to. There is nowhere else. There is nothing else that the world could tell you. That was a world, of course, and again, I'm talking about the world I know best, not your world. That was the world where newspapers refused to mention the names of other newspapers. And even today, those newspapers and magazines frequently can't bring themselves to list websites or give web addresses of other kinds of sources, as if we're still living in this world where we're trying to pretend to our readers, it's only us, you don't go anywhere else, we've got it all. Whereas our best readers are people who have a range of information sources, and they do go other places, and we shouldn't worry about that. We should be relaxed about it, because that's how we all are. So I think the one source reader simply is no more wherever you look. I think the other characteristic of this reader that is important to us is that many of us grew up in a pre-digital world where old was best. Old was proven, established, and trusted. And anything that came along new just was untested and unproven, and you wouldn't necessarily trust it. You know, we know that that isn't the case anymore. The very best digital something, whether it's a machine or a way of doing things or an information source, the very best thing you and I have ever come across may be just about to enter our lives, and we're absolutely all open to that. And I think that's what we have to remember, because in this world, again, if we're media brands, we have to remember that our hold on our readers and users is as tenuous as that. So I think, and it almost doesn't matter whether you agree with me that we won't end up with any advertising or we won't end up with much advertising, because I think the damage that advertising did to those traditional brands was to turn our heads away from the reader. Now, it wouldn't have mattered much if we'd taken all the advertising and carried on concentrating on readers, but ultimately, I don't think that's what we did. So, you know, for traditional media moving into the digital world, or types of media, if you like, in digital, it's fundamentally more important than ever that we talk first, second, third, and last about the reader. Advertising is a derivative. It can't be a core business for most information sources, I would argue. Now, having said that, I've talked of the conflict between, if you like, advertisers and readers, because that's kind of what I'm saying. Of course, it doesn't mean that advertising doesn't have a place. It just means that mostly we're having to choose between readers for our revenue or advertisers for our revenue. And on the whole, I would say to you that in the growing specialization of information, it's mostly going to be readers paying for something that they specifically want from us, and it's probably advertising paying for free media that's broader and less specific and more commoditized. So these are my 13 examples, and you'll see that I'm ranging across things that are pretty new and things that are pretty old. This is a market, of course. We've heard a bit about business newspapers that you guys are familiar with, and you'll know Financial Times. And I think that this is a traditional newspaper, of course, doing pretty traditional things in digital and doing a pretty good job of piling up subscriptions. They've had a paywall, I think, for about 12 years. And the Wall Street Journal, I think, has always, as a competitor, has always been paid online. But like all these things, there are hidden secrets of businesses, even those that seem to be doing well and perhaps a bit more vulnerable. This newspaper, which today is owned by Nikkei, a nice, patient, long-term owner, I'm assured. In practice, this is profitable, making profit margins about 10% at the moment, which is heady margins in the UK media industry, I can tell you. In practice, more than 100% of their entire profit is a print edition called the Weekend FT, published at the weekend, which is about 60 or 70% higher priced, has virtually all the advertising for the whole week, and has double the circulation. But nonetheless, I think that's an interesting, and I think I'm going through these 13 brands, some of which you'll know and some of which you won't, just as things that I think bear scrutiny and study by us. I'm not going to tell you everything about them, of course, but I think that they're businesses that are worth looking at for the strands that each of them can give us. There's a company called Meredith in the US that's currently America's biggest magazine publisher. I guess about 2 or 3 years ago, most people hadn't really heard of them. And in the last year, they bought Time Inc., which was a magazine company that really all of us have heard of. The secret of Meredith's success, however, is they publish a magazine called Better Homes and Gardens that actually has been pretty solid performer in what it sounds like. It's a women's lifestyle home care kind of magazine, holding about 7.5 million circulation a month. But in practice, the hidden success here that all kinds of publishers dream of today and don't realize that it's happening in this place is licensing. If you go into Walmart stores in the States, they are full of Better Homes and Gardens product. This company, this little company really by any comparison, is the second most successful licensing business after Disney. They are getting currently more than $100 million of profit from licensing Better Homes and Gardens merchandise. So that's an interesting model that they don't boast much about. You have to pick through the accounts very carefully to get, but that's where they are, and that's an interesting thing. I think I've heard in the last couple of days how Times of India, quite a long time ago, separated out digital from print, and that seems to me is probably the only really substantial news organization in the world that I've heard of to do that. But there's a relatively small media company in Salt Lake City owned by the Mormon Church that's been doing this for the last few years. They separated digital from print because there's a Harvard professor who wrote a really interesting paper on the fact that digital is different totally. He separated the businesses by 20 miles or something like that, and he saved his print business and created the best digital business in his territory. But in a sense, standing here in India, I don't need to dwell on that one. And then this is a woman called Mia Friedman who was an editor of magazines in Australia when I ran the largest magazine business in Australia when magazines were really hot, and she came to the conclusion that really it was ridiculous to publish anything monthly. What was the point of a monthly frequency? Is it a printer's choice or something? And she wrote a really witty paper about it. She was running a big pile of successful magazines at the time and just left to set up her business, and now the most successful women's publishing in Australia is totally online. It's her site called Mamma Mia, a tremendous community site. So I think that's an example of where the magazine publishers haven't been able to compete with themselves. So she, as a former magazine publisher, is showing them that they're making a mistake. Another area that magazine publishers dream of is e-commerce, selling products off the page. A company called Dennis, who published The Week, you may have seen. It's a really good news digest published principally in the States and in the UK. These guys sell cars off of Car Magazine database. And it's not an affiliate operation. They own the cars. They buy the cars, mostly second-hand cars, and they sell them to readers. And currently are doing, in about their second or third year, really, about 5,000 cars a year. So they're a really significant car retailer in the UK, and it's a magazine publisher. So, and what they've been able to do is to really harness the community. Car magazines, I think we all kind of recognize, tend to be read by a kind of almost a clique of people. It's not just everybody who reads car magazines. There's definite communities of people who take cars so seriously that will read about them, as opposed to many of us who would just buy them after reading a little bit of information. But these guys have diversified in an amazingly good way. I mean, that's a really interesting example. As I say, you could read more about these if you so wanted on flashesandflames.com. If you take that e-commerce thing, so media dreams of being in e-commerce, selling product instead of merely advertising it. But actually the danger is, and we heard a little bit just now about content marketing and companies promoting themselves through media, sometimes their own media. The difficulty and danger of all of that, in spite of what I've just said about this little company, Dennis, selling cars, is that actually you get a retail company, online retailer, ASOS, world's biggest retailer of clothing online, run from the UK but really everywhere, and I guess here, but I don't know. This when you look at it, you look at this website, you look at the YouTube channels, this is really as much a media company as many other women's magazine publishers are. They also actually publish a print magazine, 450,000 free copies of a print magazine. The sites are media driven, no question about that. And it makes the point that retailers, if we're not careful, and perhaps we shouldn't care, but it's a danger point, that retailers like this find it easier to become a bit media than we as media find it easier to become a bit retail. An example, you will have seen, I think, a magazine called Monocle, a really classic illustration for me of a certain kind of community. I'm not sure I'm part of this community, this sort of design-conscious, world-traveling. I'm not quite sure. If he was in the audience, I'd be more careful about how to describe it. It's quite a quirky magazine. For me, and this is doing about 80,000 copies a month, Nikkei bought into this recently and valued the business about 120 million pounds. It's clearly a print-centric media business, even though they do loads of other things. They do podcasts, so-called online radio, but it's really a series of very good podcasts. What that says to me is that we shouldn't ever be having this discussion, or shouldn't spend too much time on a discussion that says, is print dead, or is it print versus digital or something else? We just need to remember we're talking about content and community. If you have the content that only you have, that somebody wants, then if you put it in a magazine, they will be as happy as anything with a magazine. And sometimes we're just led astray by the fact that when our readers sometimes abandon us to go somewhere digital, our assumption is that we've, almost back to my first slides, the assumption is that we've had this perfect package for them, we've given them exactly what they wanted, and they've still abandoned print. Whereas probably what's happened is that we weren't giving them what they wanted in the way that they wanted it, and they found something more interesting to do. And that, in that context, whether it's print or digital, doesn't have to matter much. And that's where I think the center of my feelings about media, it's all about, and there's a bit of a debate in the last discussion, wasn't there, about whether it is owned information or shared information. There'll always be a market for all kinds of things, for loose curation of information you can find on the sidewalk, in the street, everything. You know, there's a market of some sort for almost everything, even stuff that's valued less to some of us. But if you want real value, spending an inordinate amount of time on producing and distributing and marketing information that only you have, and keeping it so that only you have it and it's distinctive, then that's a business, and you don't have to worry quite so much about the channel, because you know your readers will be able to tell you how they want the information they want. Another interesting thing, a company I've been following for about 10 years, Twit TV, stands for the Week in Technology. So this is a tech guy. It's over the, you know, it's OTT TV. Started as a series of podcasts. Essentially, it's a kind of a television channel online that's really just podcasts one after another. Get tremendous audiences. I mean, when Apple do these showcase things to announce a shiny new phone with green at the top of it or something, you get 300,000 people across the world go into sort of Google Hangout with these guys and talk about how uplifting today has been. You know, it is a very nerd, I mean, it's made for nerds and geeks. I bet there are some here, so don't be offended. But this guy, $9 million of turnover. Have I got a guess about how much profit you think this business makes? $9 million of turnover. 8 million. Now, when you look at that, and this is the point I'm making in a way. I mean, most of us are not in this kind of business. This is the people who, when there were computer magazines, were buying the whole range of them every week or every month. This is not most of us. But you can imagine this sort of approach in almost any special interest sector, actually. This guy, it's all about community. And I think those are the words. It's content and community, and they're nearly the same thing. You either give people content that only you've got, and they band around you and they become your community, or a little bit here, I reckon, is all about enjoying being part of this community and talking to nerds all around the world about how shiny iPhones are now. It's a fabulous business. Another little example, you've heard a bit about hyperlocal. Here's a multimedia business that is a miniature version of Rupert Murdoch's dream business, right? Totally multimedia. This is a town in the Swiss Alps that I haven't been to. It's 30,000 people. These guys are running online TV, radio, newspapers, and they have total command of a market. It just shows you that there are interesting examples. 30% profit margin. Then part of what I was saying earlier about the way that we might have taken readers for granted, and we've heard it referred to again today, is just the idea, is the bundle of stuff that we gave readers. We gave readers what they wanted and what we wanted to give them. And because half the time we wanted as many readers as possible, we weren't necessarily targeting very narrowly. And the more advertisers, the more broad we made it, and therefore, you might say, the more we were giving some readers things that they didn't want. We were almost growing the marginal stuff to take advertising. So the whole thing about the web, of course, is that you can unbundle properly. When iTunes came along and let us buy the one track we really wanted instead of a CD or an album of tracks we didn't want, that was the signal of what digital really meant for consumers. And it's funny that newspapers, and again, I'm talking about the rest of the world, not India, it's funny how newspapers really have been really slow to get into this, slow to get into the fact that digital means being able to give readers exactly what they want and not more than they want. And this is the example that many of us in this room will know. New York Times has been slicing into its coverage, and 300,000 people and rising subscribers alone to the daily crossword puzzle. I mean, this is a very successful digital business overall. New York Times has about 3.8 million paying subscribers, 2.9 million are digital paying subscribers. But this, it seems to me, is the most interesting thing of all, that many of us have known people to buy a newspaper for a crossword puzzle or for the sports page or something, and these guys are proving that actually, there are these specialist audiences that can make new businesses for us. This is another example. I think many of us in this room would enjoy something called theinformation.com. Because it's $500 a year, you might not want to subscribe necessarily. What this woman has proved, Jessica Lessin, who's an ex-Wall Street Journal tech reporter, what she's proved is that quality rather than quantity means a lot. So if you subscribe to the information, most of what you get is simply 2 stories a day, only 2 stories a day, that you can't get anywhere else. Original, penetrating, really good journalism, but only 2 stories a day. And you pay $500 a year for that. No advertising and nothing else that you don't want. She's got nearly 20,000 subscribers today. She's been making money more or less since about the 4th month of publishing a few years ago. And again, getting back to my sort of earlier point, she has worked out a community that needs certain kinds of information, and that's what she's doing. And her price is not anything more than what she needs to charge, because she's not taking advertising and because it isn't the world's biggest market. But she's struck a price that is a reasonable price for her and a reasonable price for her readers. I think it's a brilliant story. Again, you can imagine this nearly everywhere. Axel Springer is a really interesting German company. It was virtually 100% German media business, virtually 100% print about 10 years ago. Today, it's 70% non-German and about 70%, 75% digital. Europe's biggest selling newspaper for all of 25 years has been this newspaper Bild. This was obviously a time when Germany did better in the World Cup than more recently. It's still Europe's biggest selling newspaper, albeit selling a bit less than 2 million, whereas it had been 5 million copies. But the biggest website in Germany, non-Google website, let's put it like that, or non-Facebook, non-Google, non-Amazon website, is the free site from Bild that has 20 million uniques. And the biggest paid-for site is also theirs. It appears to be separate, of course, when you're paying, and it's 400,000 paying readers. And I think that idea of running what appear to be discrete sites, one paid that doesn't have serious amount of advertising, I think almost no advertising, and one free that is funded by advertising, really the latter being a funnel for the former, you'd think. That seems to be, and that presumably is what the Times of India's examples look like. That seems to be absolutely the strategy here. And also Hearst in the States have Houston Chronicle doing almost an identical strategy. Most British newspapers have missed the point with this completely. And again, you know, I make no apologies for talking largely about business models and corporate success and things like this. It's really interesting to look at a company called Hearst. Most of us know Hearst Corporation, and Randolph Hearst was a sort of Rupert Murdoch of the early 20th century. This corporation has, if you take my list down the right-hand side, so in the 50s and 60s, they were earning almost all their money from newspapers. In the 70s, almost all their money from magazines. In the 90s, almost all their profit from TV. And now, almost all their profit from business information. And yet, they're still in all those four areas. So that's a really interesting corporation that they've managed so far almost to rotate their business. So at a time when B2B has been easier to come to grips with digital, they've been piling into it. If you know anything about Hearst, this is a vaguely significant picture because they had a 100-and-something-year-old building that they then built some fancy new tower on top of. So it's kind of a metaphor for something, I suppose. And I think the last couple of slides I'd like to draw your attention to. This is Jessica Lessin, who's the owner, the founder of The Information. Being indispensable to a group of loyal readers. You know, the old style newspaper, magazine, going to broadest audience possible was never going to be that, and of course never was that. Trying to do a little bit of everything, publishers and journalists need, instead of trying to do a little bit of everything, we all need to focus on what we can excel at. I think that's a really good quote, personally. And then Clark Gilbert is the Harvard professor who went to Salt Lake City and changed his church's media group round. And, you know, it seems to me that is a really telling quote as well. The internet rewards specialization. If you're not the best at something, you're one click away from somebody else who is. We all kind of feel the sense of that, don't we? So I think the world for kind of traditional-ish media, let me put it like that, because really, you know, it's pretty difficult to draw the separation now between traditional and new and print and digital and so on. We're all mixed up in the whole lot. But I think you do need to be a producer of specialist content, you know, in whatever way you define specialist at. You need to be something other than the department store, I suppose. The department store has everything for everyone. Specialist stores have specific targets and specific readers. I think we all know that you have to have a level of technology, information and skill that you never used to have, because technology is such a moving thing. We all have to be on top of it in some way. I think the honest truth is, number three, that even if we in this room talk this out for the next 3 weeks, we would not reach an unarguable consensus on what was going to work for the long term and what was the dead set, surefire way for us to go. And I think we have to remember that, because many of us operate in quite large companies, and just accepting that we don't necessarily know what the winners are, and therefore doing lots of things, being versatile, is really a fundamental, of fundamental importance. I think building brands is something that I think many of us recognize, that we come from a world where you had a brand, whether it was a newspaper or magazine, and loads of ancillary activities. Now, because we don't know what the ultimate winner is, we should be building brands because that gives you more chance. And really that feeds into my last point, which is that, you know, large organizations and small organizations just need to endlessly test, because it's too easy for us to say, well, we'll try and understand the readers and try and get to know them and really build these communities. And of course that's what we are trying to do, but actually we can get it wrong all the time, and it's back to that point of, in 2 minutes time, something could come along that we'd never have expected and couldn't have contemplated, and somehow we've got to cope with it. So the more testing and the more looking at things from the other side, the better. And even if you take, say, what I was saying about having digital and print in an organization that's going from one to the other in separate silos, that isn't the end of the game either, is it? You've got to continually learn to look at yourself through the eyes of the person or company or activity that will see itself as a competitor. And the whole problem of incumbents in any industry, in any business, are that they find it difficult to compete with themselves. It's pretty uncomfortable. If your job depends on doing what you're doing, you're damn well not concentrating on beating yourself to death, but somebody else is. And I think every organization has to have people who are thinking like the would-be competitors.